The Vikings, brutal warriors whose names echo through history as fearless seafarers, ruthless conquerors, and battle-hardened legends, had one profound fear. A fear so deep it shaped their entire existence, not in the heat of battle, but in the stillness of the night. For all their prowess in war, for all their courage in the face of death, it was the quiet hours between dusk and dawn that haunted them the most. The image of a Viking warrior, armor-clad and holding an axe or sword, charging into battle with fire in his eyes is one we've all seen. And yet, in the long, cold nights of the northern lands, this same fierce warrior could be reduced to a trembling figure, too terrified to close his eyes. It was not death in battle that frightened him the most, it was sleep itself. But why would a people so resolute in the face of physical peril, who thrived in the chaos of bloodshed, be so vulnerable to a natural, unavoidable part of life? To understand this, we need to explore not only the Vikings' way of life but also their relationship with the unseen forces that govern their world, the forces that turned sleep into something far more dangerous than death itself. The fear of sleep among the Vikings is a strange paradox. We think of warriors, especially those as ferocious as the Norse, as invincible. After all, these were the men who sailed across the stormy seas to raid distant lands, who fought in brutal battles, who endured the harshest conditions the world could offer. Yet, in the quiet solitude of sleep, they were vulnerable. Their power, their bravado, all faded into nothingness when they closed their eyes. In those moments, the world of the living and the dead blurred. The fear they harbored was not just the fear of death, but of what came after death, or worse, the fear of the unseen entities that prowled the night. To truly grasp the gravity of this fear, we must first understand the Vikings' worldview. They lived in a realm where reality and myth intertwined so seamlessly that even the most mundane aspects of life were touched by the supernatural. Their gods, their warriors, their enemies, none of these existed in isolation from the spiritual forces that surrounded them. Life, for the Vikings, was always on the edge of the unknown. Their fate was governed not just by their actions, but by the will of gods, spirits, and entities far beyond their understanding. And when it came to sleep, it was not the quiet embrace of rest that called to them. It was a reminder of the power these unseen forces could hold over them. But this fear of sleep was not just rooted in superstition or belief, it was also a product of their harsh environment. Life for the Vikings was survival, pure and simple. The brutal winters, the constant threat of raids, and the unyielding nature of their lands left little room for comfort. Rest, in such a world, was a luxury, a precious commodity that could leave you vulnerable, unable to defend yourself when danger struck. The Vikings were always on edge, their senses heightened by the threats that surrounded them, and sleep, with its inherent vulnerability, was not a safe haven but a terrifying void. This wasn't merely a fear of the dark, as many might assume, but a fear of what lurked beyond the veil of consciousness. Their belief in spirits, both good and malevolent, was so ingrained that it touched every aspect of their lives, from birth to death, and of course, sleep. To close one's eyes was to enter a realm where control was lost, where one's soul could be stolen or taken by malevolent forces. It was in this dark, liminal space that the Vikings felt most exposed. Sleep, for them, wasn't just a time of physical rest. It was a time when the boundaries between life and death blurred. Legends and sagas abound with stories of warriors who never returned from their sleep, lost in dreams, taken by the gods or dragged into the underworld. For a Viking, the idea of resting at night was never simple. Sleep could mean slipping into a deep, uncontrollable slumber where you could easily drift away, never to awaken. For many, this was an unforgivable risk. The restless souls of fallen warriors, the whispers of ancient gods, and the deep, eternal silence of the grave all seemed to wait patiently for the unsuspecting dreamer. As the night would fall over the fjords, where the stars glinted eerily above the dark waters, the fear would settle over the Viking warriors like a thick, suffocating fog. Here, in the isolation of the northern lands, surrounded by darkness that could swallow the world whole, the Vikings would face their greatest battle, not with swords or shields, but with the stillness that would come when their day's work was done. This fear, however, was not just personal. It was communal. The Vikings did not face this terror alone. Their entire society, their very worldview, was marked by a kind of collective unease that permeated their stories, rituals, and even their battle strategies. In a culture that prided itself on bravery, where men were expected to face the most savage of enemies without flinching, there was no room for fear of sleep. Yet, despite their fierce reputation, sleep was the one battle they could never truly conquer. The paradox of the Viking warriors' fear of sleep is what makes it so compelling. How could a man who stood firm in the face of enemies, who charged into battles with unwavering resolve, be so vulnerable when it came to the act of resting? The answer lies not just in their beliefs, but in the raw, human experience that transcends time and culture. Sleep is the ultimate surrender. To sleep is to be vulnerable, to give up control, to trust that the world will continue spinning without your vigilance. And for the Vikings, this was a surrender they could not bear. As we delve deeper into the Vikings' understanding of sleep, death, and the spirit world, we'll discover why this primal fear gripped them so tightly. We'll uncover the ways their mythology, their spiritual beliefs, and their brutal experiences shaped their deep-seated dread of the night. Through this exploration, we'll gain a greater understanding of not just the Vikings, but of the universal human experience of vulnerability and the fear of the unknown. Sleep was never just sleep to the Vikings. It was a threshold, a gateway to something far more terrifying, a place where even the bravest warriors could not hide from what awaited them in the dark. To understand the Vikings' profound fear of sleep, we must first immerse ourselves in the worldview that shaped their entire existence. Their lives were governed by violence, uncertainty, and a constant dance with death. The harshness of the northern lands, where survival was a daily battle against nature and the elements, influenced every aspect of their culture, including how they viewed sleep. The Viking worldview was one rooted deeply in the understanding that life was fragile. They did not live in a world where things were safe and predictable. Instead, their existence was shaped by unpredictable forces, the wrath of the gods, the savage winters, the uncertainty of battles, and the ever-present threat of death. Their societies, while built on the strength and bravery of warriors, were also shaped by a very real and very terrifying fear of the unknown, of what might come after life itself. This fear of the unknown extended beyond just the physical world. For the Vikings, the boundaries between the physical and spiritual realms were not clearly defined. The line between life and death was thin, and the gods and spirits were believed to have a hand in shaping the destiny of every individual. The warriors who fought in bloody battles knew that death was a possibility with every swing of the axe or every clash of swords, but it was something they could face. Battle, however brutal, was still something they understood. It was part of their world, part of their heritage, part of their story. But sleep was something else entirely. Sleep, in the Viking mind, was a time when one's soul was unprotected, exposed to the forces that they could not see or control. The night was a time when the veil between life and death became dangerously thin. And the fear that plagued the Vikings was not merely the terror of surrendering to sleep itself, but of what might happen when the mind and body finally let go of the vigil. The daily reality for the Vikings was one of constant danger. To survive, they had to be ever watchful, ever ready. They lived on the edge, and their battles were not always fought in distant lands but often in the very heart of their own communities, in the deep, bitter winters or during raids. The North was an unforgiving place, where the winters could stretch on endlessly, leaving them exposed to the elements. Even the very land they lived on was a place of extremes, shaped by towering fjords, vast forests, and unpredictable seas. Nature, with its storms and biting cold, was as much an adversary as any human enemy. For a Viking, there was always something threatening, lurking just beyond the horizon, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. For these warriors, every day was a fight for survival. But the fear of sleep came from something even deeper, an ancient knowledge that, in a world so full of violent forces, there was very little one could do to protect themselves from the realm of dreams. Sleep was not simply a break from daily struggle. It was an entry point to a place where the rules of the physical world no longer applied. The notion of rest, so essential for most of us, became something to be feared because of its unpredictable nature. The Vikings' perception of the world was also shaped by a fundamental belief in fate. They believed that their lives were controlled by the Norns, three powerful goddesses who spun the threads of fate for every living being. To the Viking, death was a part of their fate, not an isolated event but a continuation of the journey that began at birth. The warrior's life, though violent and full of peril, had a sense of purpose. It was the path that had been chosen for them, and it led inevitably toward the grave. In this belief, there was a certain acceptance of death that made it a more comprehensible part of life. The fear that lived within them, however, was not death itself, but what came before it. Sleep, with its sense of vulnerability and its connection to the spirits of the dead, was the unknown territory they could not control. The Vikings believed that after death, the soul would either be taken to the great halls of Valhalla, where they would live in eternal glory, or to the shadowy underworld of hell. This afterlife was the ultimate reward, or punishment, for the life one led. A Viking who died in battle, slaying his enemies with honor, would be welcomed into Valhalla by Odin, the chief of the gods. But if a Viking died outside of battle, if he died from illness, old age, or, worse still, while asleep, he was cast into the dark realm of hell, ruled by the goddess of death herself. To die in battle was to live on in the eyes of the gods, to continue the saga of one's life as a hero. But to die in sleep, without honor, was the ultimate disgrace. The fear of sleep, then, was not just a fear of the body's vulnerability but a fear of losing one's honor, of failing to meet the high expectations of a warrior's life. The act of sleeping was, in a way, akin to surrendering to the dark forces of the world, forces that threatened to rob them of their very essence. It is in this context that we begin to understand the true nature of the Viking fear of sleep. To sleep was to give in to the weakness of the flesh, to expose oneself to the spirits and gods who could take advantage of that vulnerability. It was not a time of peace but a time of great peril, where one could lose their soul, their honor, and even their future. In addition to the mythological and spiritual reasons for this fear, the Vikings were also practical people, living in a world where rest was a luxury they couldn't always afford. The need to stay vigilant, to be prepared for attack at any given moment, meant that sleep was not a simple matter of shutting one's eyes. Their lives were consumed with a constant state of readiness, a readiness that was essential for survival in a world where enemies might appear at any moment. Whether they were fending off invading forces or braving the harsh wilderness, sleep was a vulnerability that could be exploited. The fear that came with it was rooted not just in superstition but in the harsh realities of their environment. The Vikings' harsh reality was one where every moment could be their last. In a world so full of chaos and uncertainty, sleep became a terrifying, uncontrollable force. To give into it, to let go of the constant vigilance that defined their lives, was a terrifying surrender to the unknown. While battle and death were terrifying, they were also known, expected. But sleep? Sleep was a place where nothing was certain, where the only thing that could be trusted was the unpredictable darkness of the night. This clash of beliefs, the Vikings' harsh, warrior-like exterior and the vulnerability they felt when faced with sleep, created a complex relationship with rest. It wasn't just a biological necessity, it was a psychological battleground. In their quest to conquer the world and achieve greatness, the Vikings had to reckon with the one thing they couldn't control: sleep. And in this struggle, sleep became a terrifying enigma, a fear that lived within them even as they conquered the world outside. In the world of the Vikings, the line between reality and myth was thin. The Norse gods and creatures were not distant figures in distant realms. They were a living, breathing presence in everyday life. The belief in the supernatural governed everything, from the rituals they performed before a battle to the way they viewed dreams and sleep. For the Vikings, sleep was not merely a rest for the body, it was a journey into the unknown, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead, the conscious and the unconscious, were blurred. And it was in this blurred space that their most profound fears lived, driven by the power of the unseen forces in their mythology. At the heart of Viking mythology lay the belief in powerful gods who controlled fate, death, and the afterlife. These gods, led by Odin, the All-Father, the Wise, the Seeker, were not distant, indifferent beings. They were intimately involved in the lives of their followers. The Vikings did not pray for favor in an abstract, distant sense. They prayed for protection, for guidance, for strength, and for victory in battle. The gods could be felt in every aspect of life, from the mighty thunder of Thor to the whispered winds of Freya. These divine beings were ever present, but they were also capricious and unknowable. And when it came to sleep, it was often the dark forces, the hidden spirits and creatures, that the Vikings feared most. In the deep silence of night, when the veil between worlds thinned, the Vikings believed that they were most vulnerable. Sleep became a passage, a doorway to these hidden realms. To close one's eyes was to cross into the realm of Hel, the underworld, where the spirits of the dead wandered. Hel, the goddess who ruled over the land of the dead, was a figure of great dread. Her realm was cold, bleak, and lifeless, a stark contrast to the warrior's paradise of Valhalla, where those who died in battle were welcomed by Odin into eternal glory. But Hel's domain was a place of shadows, where the souls of those who died without honor, those who succumbed to illness, old age, or, perhaps worse, the unguarded surrender of sleep, were cast away. It was here, in the cold emptiness of the underworld, that the Vikings feared their souls might be trapped forever. Sleep was seen as a dangerous journey, a surrender to the unseen. For many, it wasn't just the fear of rest that haunted them, but the fear of what they might encounter in the dark recesses of their own minds. Dreams, the Vikings believed, were powerful omens, windows into the future or messages from the gods. Yet they were also dangerous. A dream could be a sign of an impending death, a warning from the gods that one's fate was sealed. The world of dreams was a realm in which one's soul could be taken or distorted, where the lines between life and death could easily blur. In the mythology, there are many figures associated with the idea of dreams and sleep. Some of them were protectors, while others were malevolent spirits who could wreak havoc on a dreamer's soul. One such figure was the nightmare spirit, who would visit the sleeper at night and steal their breath, leaving them weak and vulnerable. This entity was a manifestation of the Vikings' deepest fear, that sleep was not just a break from life, but a time when the soul could be taken, lost, or damaged. It was believed that dreams, too, could be manipulated by the gods or other supernatural forces. The dreams that the Vikings experienced were not the benign, random creations of the mind, but messages from a world that was far beyond human comprehension. Even the Valkyries, those fierce, beautiful warrior maidens who chose the slain for Odin's hall, were not entirely comforting figures in the realm of sleep. Though they were associated with glorious death, the Valkyries were also thought to appear in dreams. For a Viking warrior, to dream of a Valkyrie was both an honor and a terror. It meant that death was near, but it also meant that the gods had chosen them for a higher purpose. This dream could offer the warrior a sense of peace before the end, but it could also fill him with dread, knowing that his time in the physical world was coming to a close. The Valkyries represented the dual nature of the Viking worldview. They brought both honor and fear, and in the world of dreams, they were no less formidable. The Norse gods themselves also played a role in the terror of sleep. Odin, in particular, was a god of wisdom and war, but he was also associated with the realms of the dead. As the god who ruled over Valhalla, Odin was believed to have a direct influence on the fate of warriors. But he was also a god who sought knowledge through dark and forbidden means. His willingness to sacrifice, including giving up an eye to gain knowledge of the runes, reflected his belief that the price of wisdom was high. In the context of sleep, it was believed that Odin could use dreams to communicate secrets or warnings to his followers, but that these messages often came at a great cost. To be chosen by Odin meant to face the possibility of death and transformation. In sleep, Odin's messages might appear as dark visions, and these dreams could leave the dreamer either enlightened or utterly broken. But it wasn't just the gods who instilled fear in the hearts of the Vikings. It was the darker, more malevolent creatures that lurked in the shadows of sleep. These creatures were believed to come alive in the silence of the night, waiting for an opportunity to strike. They were the spirits of the restless dead, the shades of those who had been wronged in life and were seeking vengeance. They were the dark forces that could invade dreams, enter the sleeping body, and manipulate the mind. Among these creatures were the Draugr, undead warriors who wandered the land, seeking to claim the living as their own. The Draugr were not mere ghosts, they were physical manifestations of death, capable of attacking the living even in their sleep. The Draugr's presence in the nightmares of a Viking warrior was a terrifying prospect. To dream of such a creature meant that one was being called to the realm of the dead. It was a harbinger of death, an omen that could not be ignored. Such dreams often left the dreamer in a state of dread, as they knew that the Draugr could not simply be vanquished with a sword. The only way to protect oneself from the Draugr was to fight them while awake, to prepare for death long before it arrived. In the mythology of the Vikings, sleep was not just a physical necessity but a passageway to other worlds, worlds that were fraught with danger, mystery, and the unknown. To sleep was to enter a realm where the rules of the waking world no longer applied. It was a place where gods and spirits could communicate with the living, where the dead could return to walk among the living, and where one's fate could be sealed with a single, terrifying dream. Thus, the fear of sleep was deeply rooted in the mythology of the Vikings. Sleep was not a simple act of rest but a journey into the heart of the unknown, a place where gods, spirits, and ancient forces could strike. In the silent darkness of night, when the mind drifted into slumber, the Vikings could never be sure what they would find waiting for them. The fear of the unseen, of the things that could not be understood or controlled, was the most terrifying aspect of sleep for them. And in the world of the Vikings, that fear was very real indeed. For the Vikings, dreams were not simply fragments of the subconscious mind or random neural activity during sleep. Dreams held power, true power. They were seen as messages from the gods, signs of the future, or warnings of impending doom. To the Vikings, dreams were deeply entwined with the spiritual and supernatural fabric of their world. The very act of dreaming was viewed as a sacred experience, one that demanded careful interpretation and respect. But within the eerie beauty of these nocturnal visions, there also lay a dark and unsettling fear, the fear that a dream could hold a foretelling of death, a harbinger of something terrible lurking just beyond the horizon. A Viking's dreams could be prophetic, a way for the gods to communicate with their chosen warriors. A dream, especially one that was vivid or recurring, was never to be dismissed lightly. It was believed that the gods, particularly Odin, communicated through dreams. Odin, who was both the god of wisdom and war, had the ability to send visions to those he favored. These dreams were often seen as direct messages, filled with the weight of divine intention. But such messages were never clear-cut or simple. They came wrapped in symbols and riddles, leaving the dreamer to puzzle over their meanings. To a Viking, interpreting these dreams was a skill, an art form that involved not only understanding the dream itself but also aligning it with one's fate and destiny. Yet, not all dreams were so benevolent or enlightening. While some were seen as blessings, others were feared as omens of death or misfortune. The Vikings had a particular fear of dreams that seemed to foreshadow tragedy. These dark dreams often came unbidden, carrying with them a sense of impending doom that left the dreamer with a heavy heart and a restless spirit. To dream of death, to dream of one's own demise, was a terrifying experience. These dreams were thought to be messages from the underworld, a sign that the dreamer's time in the world of the living was running out. Perhaps the most dreaded of all dreams were those involving the dead, visions of fallen comrades, ancestors, or even enemies who had died in battle. These dreams were seen as visits from the spirits of the dead, who came to convey messages, warnings, or curses. Sometimes, these dreams were interpreted as a sign that the dead were displeased with the living, that some unfinished business or unavenged wrong needed to be set right. Other times, the dead appeared in dreams to remind the living of their mortality, urging them to face their fate with courage, as death could come at any time. In the harsh and uncertain world of the Vikings, where death was an ever-present companion, dreams often served as a reminder of the fragility of life. The warrior who dreamed of his own death was forced to confront his vulnerability, something that was not easily done in a culture built on strength, honor, and bravery. To be confronted with death in one's sleep was a profound experience, a reminder that despite the might of the warrior and the glory of battle, no one could escape death forever. But the Vikings did not just fear dreams of death. Dreams could also reveal hidden knowledge, insights into the future that could guide a warrior on his path. For a Viking, knowing the future was crucial. It gave them a sense of control over the uncontrollable, a way to prepare for what lay ahead. A dream that foretold a coming battle could offer invaluable insight, allowing the dreamer to strategize and prepare. A dream of a loved one's fate could provide the guidance needed to protect them or avert disaster. The Vikings, in their belief that the world was governed by fate, understood that the gods often sent dreams to direct their actions. But even in the case of seemingly beneficial dreams, there was always an undercurrent of fear. After all, if the gods were capable of showing you glimpses of the future, they were also capable of showing you horrors. A dream that foretold victory on the battlefield might also be a subtle reminder that death was never far behind, that no warrior, no matter how valiant, could avoid the ultimate fate. Dreams were also seen as a way to communicate with the gods and to seek their favor. In a culture where the divine played an active role in everyday life, the connection between the dreamer and the divine was sacred. Rituals and sacrifices were often performed to ensure that the gods would favor the dreamer with visions that were beneficial. A dream of a divine figure like Odin or Thor could be seen as a blessing, signaling that the dreamer was under divine protection. But it was just as likely that the gods would send a dream of a dark and foreboding nature, as if to remind the dreamer that they were not beyond the reach of fate. These divine dreams were both gifts and burdens, offering wisdom while also presenting the harsh reality of a world governed by powerful, unpredictable forces. Despite their reverence for dreams, the Vikings were also cautious. Dream interpretation was not a task taken lightly. In a culture where a single decision could determine the fate of a warrior or a clan, a misinterpreted dream could be disastrous. The wise men and women of Viking society, often seers or shamans, were tasked with deciphering these dreams. They were trusted to provide clarity and guidance, ensuring that the dreamer understood the message without misjudgment. These seers, skilled in the ways of the spiritual world, had the rare ability to bridge the gap between the waking world and the dream realm, offering their interpretations as a means of navigating the often dangerous landscape of the unconscious. The Vikings also believed that dreams could be influenced by the actions and choices made in waking life. A warrior who fought bravely and with honor would likely receive dreams that reinforced his strength and courage, guiding him to further victories. But a warrior who lived dishonorably, who failed to live up to the expectations of his ancestors, would receive dreams of suffering, defeat, or even death. These dreams were seen as a reflection of the choices made in life, offering a glimpse into the consequences of one's actions. They were a form of spiritual reckoning, a way for the gods to deliver judgment before the final judgment came in the afterlife. For all their mystical and divine associations, the Vikings also saw dreams as a reflection of the human condition. Dreams could be terrifying, unsettling, and deeply emotional. They could mirror the anxieties, desires, and fears of the dreamer's waking life. A Viking who had recently lost a loved one might be haunted by dreams of their death, of their soul wandering restlessly in the afterlife. A warrior who had recently survived a battle might dream of his comrades who had fallen, their spirits reaching out for him in the night. These dreams were not just spiritual messages, they were the emotional and psychological aftermath of a life lived on the edge, where the boundary between life and death was never clearly defined. In a culture so deeply attuned to the supernatural, the fear of dreams was as real as the fear of death itself. The Vikings knew that in sleep, they entered a realm where they could be at the mercy of forces beyond their control. It was a place where the gods, the spirits, and the unknown could reach out and shape their fate. And as much as they revered the dreams that came to them, they feared what those dreams might bring. Dreams were never simple. They were mysteries, each one filled with layers of meaning, a path to understanding the future, but also a doorway to the realm of the unknown, a place where even the mightiest warrior could be rendered vulnerable. For the Vikings, the mind was as important as the body when it came to survival. While they were renowned for their physical strength, skill in combat, and strategic prowess on the battlefield, they also understood the importance of psychological warfare. Among the most insidious and effective tactics in their arsenal was the weapon of sleep deprivation, A tool not only used to gain an advantage over their enemies but also something that deeply affected their own relationship with rest and sleep. It was a psychological weapon, a way to wear down the will of an opponent and erode their mental defenses. But the strange irony of this strategy was that it also contributed to the Vikings' own terror of sleep, making the very act of rest a terrifying vulnerability. Sleep deprivation was not just a tactic, it was a reality of Viking life. Their raids, often spanning days or even weeks, took place in far-flung lands, where the constant need to stay vigilant was paramount. The Vikings had to be constantly on alert, ready for surprise attacks, ambushes, or the unpredictable nature of the environment they were in. As a result, sleep was often sacrificed for the sake of survival. During long voyages across the stormy seas or when laying siege to a settlement, the Vikings would often go without sleep for days at a time, forced to rely on their physical and mental endurance to carry them through. This strategic deprivation of rest was not just about staying awake for longer hours, it was about breaking the enemy's will. Vikings were aware of the power of fatigue. They knew that when the mind and body became exhausted, the ability to think clearly, react quickly, and fight effectively diminished. They understood that prolonged sleep deprivation could cause confusion, irritability, and even hallucinations, and they used this knowledge to their advantage when facing adversaries. By depriving their enemies of sleep, they could create disorientation and fear, making it easier to conquer them. The Vikings were not just brutal warriors, they were cunning and understood the psychology of warfare. They knew that keeping their enemies awake, on edge, and paranoid was as effective as wielding a sword. In the midst of a battle, when the mind was already under stress, the effects of sleep deprivation could create a sense of vulnerability that was even more crippling than the physical wounds inflicted in combat. The warriors on the receiving end of this strategy would often find themselves unable to think clearly, their bodies heavy with exhaustion, their reactions slowed. It became a fight not only against the enemy but also against the body's desperate need for rest, a need that the Vikings knew could break the strongest of foes. For the Vikings themselves, however, sleep deprivation was a double-edged sword. While it allowed them to gain advantages over their enemies, it also left them vulnerable in ways that they did not fully comprehend. The constant lack of rest, the sleepless nights spent on watch or during raids, began to take its toll on their mental and emotional well-being. The Vikings, despite their rugged exterior and stoic determination, were not immune to the effects of sleep deprivation. In fact, this lack of rest became one of the most insidious forms of torment, one that crept into their lives in subtle ways, leaving a lasting mark on their psyche. The effects of sleep deprivation were far-reaching. The Vikings, like any other people, needed sleep to function at their best, but the constant pressure to remain alert and vigilant kept them from experiencing the restorative rest their bodies desperately needed. This chronic exhaustion would have made them more prone to mental fatigue, heightened stress, and a general sense of unease. They were warriors, after all, and the demands of their world were unforgiving. As their physical and mental states began to deteriorate, so too did their ability to cope with the very fear they had once been able to face without hesitation. The terror of sleep, the very thing they had learned to fear as the ultimate vulnerability, became magnified, intensifying as they endured sleepless nights and the gnawing anxiety that accompanied their inability to rest. The fear of sleep in the Viking psyche, then, was not just a spiritual or mythological fear, it was a deeply practical one. Sleep was not just a time to rest the body, it was a period of exposure, a time when the mind and body were most vulnerable to the forces of fatigue, fear, and the unknown. The longer a Viking was deprived of sleep, the more their vulnerability increased. The body began to break down, mental clarity faded, and the mind became susceptible to the very forces they feared most, the spirits, the gods, and the darkness that lingered beyond the realm of consciousness. This constant state of alertness, of never truly being able to rest, left the Vikings in a perpetual state of tension. The warrior who went without sleep might win battles, but he would lose the war within himself. The exhaustion of the body was mirrored by the erosion of his mental and emotional strength. The deeper the exhaustion, the more terrifying sleep became, as it represented the very thing they could not afford: the loss of control, the surrender of vigilance, and the risk of slipping into the unknown. Yet, paradoxically, Sleep was also something they desperately longed for. In the midst of their grueling voyages and endless battles, the Vikings must have yearned for rest, the deep, undisturbed sleep that would bring them relief. But to sleep, to surrender to that need, was to expose themselves to the dangers of the night, to enter a vulnerable state where the mind could wander into the very realms they feared most. The desire for sleep, mixed with the terror it invoked, created a complex relationship with rest. It was both a necessity and a threat, a paradox that echoed through every Viking's life. The chronic lack of sleep among the Vikings did not just manifest in their physical exhaustion. It seeped into their social structure, their rituals, and their very identities as warriors. Sleep, or the lack thereof, became a symbol of their endurance and resilience. Those who went without rest were revered for their strength, their ability to push past the limits of their human endurance. Yet, this very endurance came at a price. The prolonged stress and lack of sleep would have contributed to a culture of constant anxiety and unease, where rest was both sought after and feared in equal measure. Sleep deprivation in the Viking world was not merely a byproduct of their harsh lifestyle, it was woven into the fabric of their warrior ethos. It was a tool of survival, a weapon in their psychological warfare, and yet it was also a source of deep, existential dread. For the Vikings, sleep was never just sleep, it was a battlefield in its own right, one where the price of victory was steep, and the consequences of defeat were hauntingly real. To rest, to let go, was to give in to the very vulnerability they fought so hard to avoid. And in the end, it was this complex, paradoxical relationship with sleep that left the Vikings trapped in a never-ending cycle of battle, both against their enemies and against the deep, consuming fear of what lay waiting in the darkness of the night. The Vikings, like many ancient cultures, were deeply influenced by their beliefs in the supernatural and the unseen forces that shaped their world. Their lives were woven into a rich tapestry of rituals, superstitions, and sacred practices, all of which sought to protect them from the unknown and prepare them for the dangers that lurked in both the waking world and the realm of dreams. Sleep, for the Vikings, was never just a biological need. It was a sacred and vulnerable time when the boundary between the physical world and the spiritual world was at its thinnest. As such, they developed various rituals and superstitions surrounding sleep to ward off the dangers they believed could arise during these hours of rest. These practices not only protected them from malevolent spirits or dreams but also served to reinforce the profound fear they had of sleep itself. The Vikings were a people who understood the power of rituals. Their beliefs were deeply embedded in every aspect of their lives, from the simplest daily chores to the most sacred ceremonies. Sleep, as one of the most vulnerable and dangerous times in their existence, was treated with the utmost care and reverence. To close one's eyes was to enter a realm where the rules of the physical world no longer applied, and the dangers of that realm could take many forms. The Vikings believed that the act of sleeping exposed the soul, making it vulnerable to attack by spirits, gods, and even the restless dead. For this reason, they had numerous customs and superstitions designed to ensure a safe passage through the night. One of the most prevalent beliefs among the Vikings was that evil spirits, particularly those of the dead, could haunt a person's dreams and even possess their body while they slept. This was why sleep was such a terrifying vulnerability. To fall asleep was to enter a realm where one was no longer in control. As a result, many Vikings would perform rituals before going to bed to protect themselves from these malicious entities. The most common of these was the practice of placing weapons, usually a sword or an axe, by the bedside. The belief was that these tools of war, which had protected them in life, would ward off evil spirits in death, preventing them from entering the dream world or possessing the sleeping body. The sword was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of strength and protection, and it was thought that its mere presence could keep the sleeper safe from the lurking dangers of the night. In addition to physical protections, the Vikings also relied on verbal and symbolic rituals to shield themselves from the supernatural forces that might prey on their sleep. Certain incantations and prayers to the gods were said before lying down to sleep, invoking the protection of Odin, Thor, and the other gods of the Viking pantheon. These prayers would be whispered softly, as if calling on the gods to guard the dreamer from harm. But these words were not said lightly. They carried deep significance, as they connected the mortal realm to the divine and sought to reinforce the idea that the gods were actively involved in the protection of the living. Some of the most important rituals were those designed to guard against nightmares and the supernatural forces that could invade the dream realm. One of the most famous Viking legends involving sleep and nightmares is the story of the mare, a malevolent spirit who would sit on the chest of the sleeping, suffocating them in their sleep. The word nightmare itself is derived from this mythological creature. In Viking culture, the mare was believed to be a spirit who could enter a person's sleep and cause them great distress, sometimes leading to death or insanity. To prevent the mare from visiting, the Vikings would often perform protective rites before sleep. These included sleeping in certain positions, such as facing a particular direction or sleeping with one's head covered. The idea was that by following these rituals, one could outsmart the mare and avoid being crushed by its unseen weight. Another common belief was that the dead would return in the night, either in dreams or as wandering spirits. This belief was particularly strong among the Vikings, who saw death not as an end but as a transition into another world. In this view, the dead were not entirely gone but continued to have an influence on the living. The restless dead, those who had not died honorably in battle or who had unfinished business, were believed to roam the world at night, particularly during sleep. In order to keep these spirits at bay, the Vikings would often perform rituals involving fire, which was considered a purifying force. Lighting a fire before bed was thought to drive away evil spirits and provide warmth and protection against the cold, dark forces of the night. Sometimes, the Vikings would also keep sacred objects or talismans near their bed, such as a piece of iron or a charm from their ancestors, as a way to draw on the strength of their forebears and ensure a safe night's rest. In some instances, the fear of the dead and their potential return during sleep would lead to even more elaborate measures. For example, a Viking warrior might sleep with his armor on, or at least nearby, ready to defend himself in case the spirits of the dead came to claim him. While this practice might seem extreme, it highlights just how deeply the Vikings feared the vulnerability of sleep. They did not see sleep as a natural, peaceful process. It was a liminal space, a threshold between the living and the dead, between the conscious and the unconscious. This belief in the ever-present potential for the dead to return, especially during sleep, drove many of the rituals and superstitions surrounding rest. The belief in the importance of dreams also played a significant role in Viking sleep rituals. As we have seen, the Vikings believed that dreams were messages from the gods or omens of things to come. They did not take these dreams lightly, as they were seen as direct channels of communication between the mortal world and the divine. To ensure that their dreams would be meaningful and not filled with disturbing, dark images, the Vikings would often perform specific acts before sleep. Some would drink certain herbal concoctions, believing that these potions could induce more favorable dreams, ones that were more in line with the gods' will. Others would sleep in sacred places, such as near burial mounds or within consecrated halls, where the divine presence was believed to be strongest. The aim was to align the dreamer with the divine, ensuring that their dreams would offer protection, guidance, or even victory in battle. One particularly important sleep ritual was tied to the Vikings' understanding of fate. The Norns, the three goddesses who controlled destiny, were said to weave the threads of life for each individual, determining their fate from birth to death. In some Viking traditions, individuals would pray to the Norns before sleep, asking for a dream that would reveal something about their future or their fate. These prayers were deeply personal, as they sought to connect the dreamer with their own destiny. To dream of the Norns or of other deities who controlled fate was considered a great blessing, for it was believed to provide insight into one's purpose in life or a revelation about the events that were to come. While many of these rituals were designed to protect the sleeper from evil spirits or the return of the dead, others were focused on enhancing the sleeper's connection to the divine and the mystical. The Vikings saw sleep not as an ordinary state but as an entry into a supernatural world, one where dreams were powerful and could shape the future. Through their rituals and superstitions, they sought to navigate this dangerous, mysterious realm with the guidance of the gods and the protection of their ancestors. Ultimately, the legacy of Viking sleep rituals and superstitions reflects the deep-seated fear and reverence they had for the act of sleep itself. It was not merely a time of rest but a moment of vulnerability, a time when the boundaries between life and death were at their most fluid. The rituals they developed were designed to protect the sleeper from the unseen dangers that might lurk in the night, and through these practices, the Vikings tried to exert control over a fearsome and uncontrollable force, the mysterious world of sleep. Living in a world that demanded constant vigilance was a burden the Vikings carried with them every day. Their society was built around the concept of preparedness, always ready for battle, always ready for raids, always ready for the unexpected. This unyielding state of alertness, while essential for survival in the harsh and often hostile environment they inhabited, came at a steep psychological cost. The toll of perpetual vigilance and the fear of what could happen in the dead of night was an ever-present shadow in the lives of the Vikings. For them, sleep was not just a reprieve from the day's battles or a necessary biological function. It was a profound psychological struggle, fraught with anxiety, fear, and the heavy weight of mortality. The psychological toll of constant vigilance was most apparent in the way the Vikings perceived rest. They did not experience the kind of peace that comes with a simple act of lying down and letting go. Sleep was a state of vulnerability, an opening through which the forces of death, the gods, and the unknown could slip into their lives. The constant need to stay alert, to be ever ready for an attack or a sudden shift in fate, meant that the Vikings' minds were rarely at rest. They were warriors, but they were also deeply aware of the fragility of life. To be a Viking was to live with the ever-present fear that the next battle could be your last, the next raid could spell the end of your existence. In a world defined by this constant tension between life and death, sleep became a luxury they could not afford, an escape that was both desired and feared. In their quest to protect themselves from the dangers of sleep, the Vikings developed a mentality of constant readiness. The fear of sleep was not just a physical fear but a psychological one. It was a fear that came from within, a deep-seated anxiety that had been cultivated by years of surviving in a world filled with peril. When you live on the edge, when every day is a fight for survival, the idea of surrendering to rest becomes difficult. Sleep, in the Viking worldview, was a symbol of weakness, a necessary but dreaded surrender to the unknown. This constant battle between the need for rest and the fear of vulnerability created an internal conflict that left lasting psychological scars. The Vikings were also acutely aware of the psychological effects of prolonged periods of sleeplessness. They knew that fatigue could weaken the mind and dull the senses. The weariness that came from lack of rest could cause irritability, cloud judgment, and create a sense of paranoia. In their raids and battles, the Vikings understood that mental clarity was as important as physical strength. But when exhaustion set in, the body and mind became more susceptible to fear and uncertainty. This heightened sense of fear, coupled with the constant pressure to remain vigilant, would lead to a state of chronic anxiety, a psychological burden that haunted the Vikings even in the quietest moments. The relentless stress of this constant state of alertness also contributed to a heightened sense of paranoia. The Vikings were warriors, trained to be cautious and always prepared for the worst. They lived in a world where enemies could strike at any moment, and every rustling leaf or crack in the wood could signal danger. This sense of imminent threat was not limited to the battlefield, it extended into their daily lives. The Vikings were accustomed to watching their backs, never truly feeling safe or secure. This constant hypervigilance created an atmosphere of tension, where every unexpected sound or movement was scrutinized for potential danger. The fear of betrayal, the fear of being ambushed, and the fear of what lurked in the shadows became a part of their psyche. These fears were not easily dismissed. They became ingrained in their daily lives, creating an environment where anxiety and suspicion were as common as the cold northern winds. The psychological strain of constant vigilance also affected the Vikings' relationships with each other. Trust was paramount in their society, especially in battle, where warriors relied on one another for survival. But the constant need to be on guard made it difficult for them to fully relax, even around their closest companions. The paranoia that accompanied this state of readiness created a sense of isolation. No matter how close the bonds of brotherhood or friendship, the Vikings knew that they could not afford to fully trust anyone. A warrior who had slept in his camp might wake up to find his belongings stolen, or worse, his comrades turned against him. This fear of betrayal, of enemies within as well as outside, added another layer of psychological burden to an already exhausting existence. One of the most significant psychological effects of this constant vigilance was the toll it took on their perception of time. For the Vikings, time was fluid. They did not experience time in the same way that modern societies do. Time was marked not by clocks or calendars but by events, seasons, and cycles. For the warrior, time was something that could slip away unnoticed, swallowed by the endless march of battles, raids, and the threat of death. Without the regular rhythms of rest, time became distorted. The days would blur together, and the cycle of battle and recovery would leave the Vikings with little sense of true respite. The longer the vigil lasted, the harder it became to distinguish between the waking world and the world of dreams. Exhaustion blurred the lines between reality and the hallucinations that came from a mind deprived of rest. This lack of clear perception added to the psychological strain, as it became difficult to know what was real and what was merely a product of fatigue and fear. The impact of this constant vigilance was also felt in the warrior's ability to engage in self-reflection. In a society that valued honor and the warrior code above all else, self-reflection was vital. The Vikings needed to assess their actions, their victories, and their failures in order to maintain their honor and their sense of identity. But the constant state of alertness left little room for introspection. The mind was consumed with the present danger, the need to survive, and the fear of what might come next. There was little opportunity for contemplation, for the deep thinking that would allow a person to process the psychological toll of their experiences. Without this, the emotional wounds of war, the trauma, the grief, the guilt, could not heal. Instead, they festered, contributing to a sense of mental fragmentation. The inability to rest or reflect also made it difficult for the Vikings to make sense of the larger picture of their lives. In a world so focused on the immediate threats of battle and survival, the long-term consequences of their actions were often lost in the chaos. The psychological toll of constant vigilance was compounded by the absence of a clear, overarching narrative. The Vikings did not have the luxury of reflecting on their place in the world or considering the future of their people. Every decision, every action, was made with the urgency of survival in mind. And in the absence of this long-term perspective, they could not fully process the meaning of their struggles. Ultimately, the psychological toll of constant vigilance left the Vikings trapped in a cycle of fear, exhaustion, and paranoia. Sleep, the very thing they needed to heal and rejuvenate, was the one thing they feared most. In a world where death was an ever-present companion and the threat of violence was a constant reality, sleep was an act of vulnerability. It was a time when the mind and body could be overwhelmed by the forces they could not control. This constant battle against exhaustion, against the fear of the unknown, and against the horrors of the dream world left the Vikings living in a perpetual state of anxiety. Their bravery, their strength, and their readiness for battle were all tempered by the deep psychological toll that their world exacted from them. And in the quiet of the night, when the battle for survival paused, they faced the greatest fear of all, the terror of sleep. In the harsh and unforgiving world of the Vikings, the concept of death was inseparable from the pursuit of glory. The two were not opposites but intertwined, and in many ways, death was viewed as the ultimate gateway to eternal honor and recognition. For the Vikings, life was a continuous dance with death, an acceptance that each day could be their last, yet simultaneously a drive to live fiercely and earn their place among the gods in Valhalla. This tension between glory and death permeated their culture, shaping their attitudes toward warfare, honor, and even sleep itself. It created an existential paradox. While the Vikings revered death as a natural part of life, they also feared the vulnerability that sleep represented, knowing that it could be a time when they would be most exposed to the unknown forces of fate. The Vikings, unlike many other cultures, did not fear death in the same way that modern societies do. They did not view it as an end to be avoided at all costs. Instead, they saw it as a passage, a transformation into a different realm, a step toward glory and eternal life in Valhalla, the Hall of Odin. To die in battle, with sword in hand and honor intact, was the highest achievement a Viking could aspire to. The warriors who fell in battle were considered chosen by the gods, and their bravery in the face of death was a mark of distinction. In Valhalla, they would feast and fight alongside the gods for all eternity, preparing for the final, apocalyptic battle of Ragnarok. This belief created a complex relationship with death. On one hand, death was seen as the gateway to eternal glory, and the Viking warrior welcomed it. But on the other hand, the Vikings were all too aware of the unpredictability of death. They lived in a world where death could come at any moment, not just in battle, but from sickness, treachery, or even the whims of the gods. Death, though revered, was also feared, because it was not always a glorious death that a Viking received. The very possibility that death could come in a dishonorable form, such as from an illness or from old age, was one of the greatest sources of fear and anxiety. To be struck down in battle was to achieve the ultimate glory, but to die in one's sleep, weak and vulnerable, was to face death in the most dishonorable way. This is where the paradox of the Vikings' relationship with sleep lies. Sleep was the ultimate vulnerability, a time when the warrior's body was unguarded, defenseless against the dangers of the world. For the Vikings, sleep was not a peaceful rest but a time fraught with anxiety. It was during sleep that the mind wandered into the realms of dreams, where it could encounter the spirits of the dead, the gods, and the unpredictable forces of fate. To fall asleep was to submit to the unknown, and that uncertainty was something that the Vikings, who prided themselves on their control over their own destinies, could not fully embrace. The fear of sleep, then, was closely tied to the fear of a dishonorable death. If a warrior were to succumb to death in his sleep, without a fight, without a struggle, it was seen as the ultimate disgrace. The warrior who died peacefully, unaware and vulnerable, would never achieve the honor he sought in life. In contrast, a warrior who met death on the battlefield, facing his fate with bravery and defiance, was honored by both his peers and the gods. His death was not an end but a triumph, a testament to his strength and his spirit. The Viking warrior knew that his place in Valhalla was guaranteed only through a death that was both glorious and meaningful. For them, the true terror of sleep was the fear that it could rob them of that glory, leaving them exposed to an unseen fate. This tension between glory and death also shaped the Vikings' understanding of war. For them, war was not just a matter of survival, it was a way to achieve immortality. Battle was the proving ground where one could earn eternal honor, a place where a warrior could write his name into the sagas. Each battle was not just a fight for victory, it was an opportunity to die honorably. To fall in battle was to be immortalized, to enter the realm of the gods. The desire for this kind of death shaped the Vikings' culture in profound ways. It drove them to push the limits of endurance, to fight with relentless intensity, to face overwhelming odds without hesitation. The Viking warrior believed that death in battle would bring him the greatest reward, eternal glory, companionship with the gods, and a place among the heroes of the past. But this relentless pursuit of glory also meant that the Vikings lived in a state of constant tension, knowing that death was always near. The glory of battle and the promise of Valhalla were powerful motivators, but they also created a constant awareness of the fragility of life. The Vikings were acutely aware that any raid, any battle, could be their last. They knew that death was a constant companion, lurking just beyond the edge of the battlefield or the horizon. The tension between wanting to achieve glory through battle and the fear of the unknown, the unpredictable nature of death, created a profound existential conflict within the Viking warrior. This conflict was also reflected in the Vikings' approach to life. While death was revered and glorified in the context of battle, it was something to be feared when it came from other sources. The Viking warrior understood that death was inevitable, but he also understood that how one met death was of paramount importance. A death in battle, surrounded by comrades, fighting for a cause, was the ultimate expression of Viking values. A death from sickness, old age, or in sleep, however, was a failure to live up to those values. This created a deep fear of the unknown, a fear that sleep, the act of surrendering oneself to the night, could bring about a death that was not worthy of a warrior's legacy. To die in one's sleep, without honor, without the opportunity to fight and defend oneself, was to be robbed of the chance to achieve glory. It was the antithesis of the Viking warrior's ideal death, the one that would lead him to Valhalla. And yet, sleep was an unavoidable part of life. No matter how fierce or brave a Viking might be, he still had to surrender to sleep. This vulnerability in the face of something so natural and necessary created a tension between the Vikings' cultural ideals and the reality of his existence. It was this very tension that made sleep so terrifying for the Viking warrior. To be awake was to be in control, to be vigilant, to be ready to face whatever dangers might arise. But when one slept, one was helpless, exposed to the unknown. This was the great paradox of the Viking mindset. The very act of resting, of giving in to the need for sleep, was a submission to fate, a submission that could potentially cost a warrior everything he had fought for in life. The tension between the desire for glory and the fear of death, coupled with the fear of vulnerability in sleep, created a psychological burden that was ever present in the lives of the Vikings. And yet, despite the fear, the Vikings also embraced death and sleep as part of the cycle of life. They knew that they could not control when or how death would come, but they could control how they lived and how they faced that inevitable end. Glory in life was achieved through courage and strength, and glory in death was achieved through honor. Sleep, though terrifying in its vulnerability, was ultimately just another part of the warrior's journey, a journey that, whether one died in battle or in bed, would be remembered in the sagas, forever immortalized. The tension between glory and death, the fear and acceptance of sleep, was something that every Viking lived with, shaping their actions, their relationships, and their beliefs, all the way to the end. To be a Viking warrior was to exist in a constant state of tension between fear and bravery. Fear was an ever-present companion, lurking in the shadows, yet it was also something that the Viking warriors learned to embrace as an integral part of their identity. It was not a weakness, but rather a defining characteristic of their strength. For the Viking, fear was something to be faced head-on, something that tested and honed their resolve. The warrior's mentality, forged in the fires of battle and shaped by the relentless demands of their world, taught them not to shy away from fear but to confront it, to rise above it, and to use it to fuel their courage. The Viking warrior's mentality was rooted in the understanding that fear, while unavoidable, was not something that should control or dominate one's life. Fear, in the Viking worldview, was a natural reaction to the dangers of the world, whether it was the threat of an enemy raid, the unpredictable forces of nature, or the ever-present specter of death. It was a reflection of the warrior's awareness of his own mortality. And yet, despite its constant presence, fear was something the Vikings learned to transcend, using it to sharpen their focus, to fuel their determination, and to remind them of the value of life itself. The Vikings had a unique way of reframing fear. Rather than seeing it as something to be eradicated, they embraced it as a source of power. Fear was an acknowledgement of the stakes, a recognition of what could be lost if one failed. It was a motivator, a reminder to be vigilant, to remain sharp, and to never underestimate the dangers that might arise. The Vikings understood that life was fragile, and death was always waiting in the wings. But rather than retreating in fear of it, they used the knowledge of death's inevitability to push themselves to live with greater intensity, to fight with greater ferocity, and to embrace the present moment with everything they had. The warrior's mentality was also shaped by the harsh realities of Viking society. The Vikings were not only trained to fight but also to endure, to withstand the emotional and psychological toll of living in such a violent world. This world was unforgiving, and to survive it required an iron will. Every Viking, from the youngest shield-bearer to the most seasoned warrior, understood that fear was part of the equation. It was simply something to be managed, to be accepted as a natural part of their experience, and then set aside when action was required. The concept of berserkergang, the legendary state of battle frenzy in which a Viking warrior would fight with wild abandon, was an extreme example of how the Vikings dealt with fear. In this frenzied state, the warrior would reportedly lose all sense of fear and pain, becoming an unstoppable force on the battlefield. The berserkers were said to channel their fear into rage, letting go of any hesitation or self-preservation instincts. They fought with a raw, unyielding intensity, throwing themselves into the battle without regard for their own safety or well-being. In doing so, they transcended the fear that normally accompanied the chaos of battle. For a moment, the fear of death, the vulnerability of sleep, and the terror of the unknown were all vanquished. However, the berserker mentality was not the only way the Vikings dealt with fear. The majority of Viking warriors did not lose themselves in such frenzied states, but they still relied on the power of their mental fortitude to overcome fear. The key to overcoming fear, for most Vikings, was their unshakable belief in their fate. The Vikings had a unique relationship with fate and destiny, shaped by their belief in the Norns, the three goddesses who controlled the threads of life. It was said that these goddesses wove the destinies of every individual, deciding when a person would live and when they would die. The Vikings understood that their lives were not entirely in their own hands, but that did not mean they were powerless. Instead, the Vikings believed in facing their fate with courage, no matter what it held. Whether they died on the battlefield or in their sleep, they believed it was all part of the grand design woven by the Norns. The warrior's mentality, then, was based on the understanding that they could not control everything, but they could control how they responded to the inevitable. They could choose to embrace their fate, to fight with all their strength, and to die with honor, knowing that their death was not an end but a continuation of their journey. This belief gave the Vikings a profound sense of peace, even in the face of overwhelming danger. It allowed them to overcome the crippling fear that could paralyze lesser men. In battle, this mindset was essential. The Vikings knew that fear could be a force that crippled their enemies, causing hesitation, uncertainty, and retreat. But it could also be a force that crippled their own warriors if they allowed it to take hold. This was why the Viking warrior mentality was so crucial. It taught them not to allow fear to dictate their actions. Fear was present, yes, but it was not the defining factor in how a warrior fought. The Viking's true strength lay in his ability to acknowledge fear, to respect it, and then to rise above it. This mentality also extended to their relationships with each other. The Vikings had a deep sense of brotherhood, one that was forged through shared experiences of battle, hardship, and fear. This camaraderie was essential in helping warriors manage fear. A Viking who faced danger alongside his comrades was less likely to be paralyzed by fear because he knew that he was not alone. The bonds between Viking warriors were built on trust, loyalty, and mutual respect. In the heat of battle, a Viking could look to his comrades for support, drawing strength from the shared commitment to victory. Together, they could face the horrors of war, the dangers of the unknown, and the specter of death with a sense of unity and purpose. The Vikings' ability to face fear was also a product of their deep connection to their culture and their values. Viking society was built on principles of honor, strength, and bravery. A warrior's reputation was everything. To be known as a coward, to show fear in the face of battle, was one of the greatest dishonors a Viking could suffer. This cultural pressure reinforced the mentality that fear was not something to succumb to but something to conquer. The fear of failure, of being seen as weak, was a powerful motivator for the Viking warrior. The desire to live up to the ideals of Viking society, to be remembered as a hero, was often stronger than the fear of death itself. The Vikings also learned to manage fear through their connection to the divine. They believed that the gods, particularly Odin, Thor, and Freya, were not distant and indifferent deities but active participants in their lives. The gods provided guidance, protection, and favor, and the Vikings believed that by living in accordance with their values, they could earn the favor of the gods. This belief in divine support gave the Vikings the courage to face the unknown with confidence. They did not fear death because they believed that the gods had already written their fate. Whether in battle or in sleep, they knew that their actions would be judged by the gods, and that judgment would determine their place in the afterlife. In the end, the Viking warrior mentality was not about the absence of fear, but about the mastery of fear. It was a mentality that taught the warrior to face fear with resolve, to acknowledge it without being ruled by it. It was about the ability to stand tall in the face of the unknown, to fight not for the absence of fear, but for the strength to move beyond it. The Viking warrior understood that fear was an inevitable part of life, but it was the ability to rise above it, to use it as fuel for action, that made them truly unstoppable. And in this way, The Viking mentality became a model for overcoming fear in the harshest of circumstances. The Vikings' fear of sleep, though rooted in the vulnerability of the body and mind, was also deeply intertwined with their rich and complex belief system. Norse mythology, with its gods, spirits, and ancient legends, played a significant role in shaping the Vikings' perception of sleep as a realm fraught with danger and supernatural forces. The Vikings did not see sleep as a simple biological function. Rather, it was a mystical and perilous threshold between the mortal realm and the unseen world of spirits and gods. Within the context of Norse mythology, sleep was not only a time of rest but a liminal space where the veil between life and death, the conscious and unconscious, was at its thinnest. At the heart of Viking beliefs were the gods of Asgard, and their stories deeply influenced the way the Vikings understood both life and death. For the Norse, sleep was a sacred time, a journey into the unknown that was often filled with both fear and wonder. Norse mythology was rife with stories of gods and goddesses who had the power to influence the dreams of mortals, guiding them, testing them, or tormenting them. The dream world was not a peaceful or serene place. It was a land inhabited by both benevolent and malevolent forces, and the Vikings knew that their journey into sleep might bring them face to face with these powers. One of the most prominent figures in Norse mythology associated with dreams and sleep was Odin, the Allfather, the god of wisdom, war, and death. Odin's relationship with sleep was complex and filled with mystical significance. He was known to travel in and out of the dream world, seeking knowledge and insight. It was said that Odin sacrificed his own eye in exchange for the ability to see beyond the mortal realm, gaining wisdom that transcended the waking world. He was a god who saw the value in the unseen, in the knowledge that could only be attained through dreams or visions. Yet, despite his wisdom, Odin was also a figure associated with the terrifying aspects of fate and death. His connection to sleep, therefore, was not without its dangers. He was known to send dreams and visions to mortals, sometimes to offer guidance, and other times to instill fear. The Vikings would have been acutely aware that while sleep could bring wisdom, it could also bring omens of impending doom. The gods, including Odin, were deeply involved in the lives of mortals, and their influence extended into the realm of dreams. For the Vikings, sleep was a time when they were vulnerable to the gods' whims, a time when fate could be shaped or sealed, often without warning. Odin's role in the realm of sleep was not limited to the offering of wisdom. The god also presided over the Hall of Valhalla, where the souls of fallen warriors were believed to go after death. This connection to the afterlife added another layer of complexity to the Viking fear of sleep. For the warrior, sleep was not merely an innocent rest. It was a time when the spirit was in a state of suspension, hovering between life and death. The fear of an untimely or dishonorable death would often manifest as a fear of sleep itself. The Vikings believed that if they were to die in their sleep, their souls might not be able to make the journey to Valhalla, leaving them trapped in a limbo-like existence. This idea of an unresolved death, one that occurred without battle or honor, created a deep sense of anxiety around sleep. Another key figure in Viking mythology who influenced their perception of sleep was Freya, the goddess of love, fertility, and war. Freya was also associated with death and the afterlife, particularly with the concept of the afterlife for warriors. It was believed that half of the warriors who fell in battle were chosen by Freya to reside in her hall, Folkvanger, while the other half went to Valhalla. Freya's connection to death, love, and sleep made her a powerful and sometimes ominous figure in the Viking psyche. Her ability to influence the passage of the soul into the afterlife, as well as her role in shaping the fates of mortals, further deepened the Vikings' fear of sleep as a gateway to the unknown. But it wasn't just the gods who were said to have dominion over sleep and dreams. Norse mythology also features a host of supernatural beings, some malevolent, others more neutral, who were believed to enter the realm of sleep. One of the most notable of these was the Mare, a terrifying spirit that haunted sleepers in the night. The word nightmare itself is derived from this entity. The Mare was said to sit on the chest of the sleeper, causing them to feel a crushing weight and often inducing paralysis. This malevolent spirit was believed to be a manifestation of the fear that accompanied sleep, a symbol of the danger and vulnerability the Vikings felt when they closed their eyes. The mare was just one example of how sleep was fraught with danger in Viking belief, as the spirits of the dead or mischievous entities could enter the sleeping world, tormenting or possessing the dreamer. The mare was often associated with the restless spirits of the dead. In Viking belief, the dead could return in many forms, including in dreams. Some of these spirits were benign, offering guidance or warnings, but others were more sinister. The fear that the dead could reach across the veil into the living world, especially during sleep, created a deep sense of unease for the Vikings. These spirits might appear in dreams as revenants, seeking to settle unfinished business, or as harbingers of doom. The Vikings feared that their dreams could be infiltrated by these restless spirits, that their sleep might be disturbed by the return of the dead. To die without honor, without a death on the battlefield, was one of the greatest fears of a Viking, and the thought that they could be haunted by the spirits of the dead after sleep added a terrifying dimension to the Viking experience of the afterlife. In addition to the malevolent spirits and the gods, the Vikings believed that their dreams could be shaped by the forces of fate itself. The Norns, the three goddesses who controlled the fates of all mortals, were said to weave the threads of life and death. These threads were not just metaphysical concepts but tangible forces that could affect the dreams of those who slept. The Norns were believed to influence the dreams of warriors, offering glimpses into the future or revealing signs of impending doom. For the Vikings, dreams were a way to receive guidance from these powerful beings, but they could also be a harbinger of death or misfortune. The fear that one's dreams might be manipulated by the Norns was yet another layer of anxiety surrounding sleep. In the world of the Vikings, sleep was never just an escape from the waking world. It was a place where the boundaries between life and death were blurred, where the gods and spirits could enter, and where fate itself could be revealed. Norse mythology, with its pantheon of gods, spirits, and supernatural forces, played a pivotal role in shaping how the Vikings viewed sleep. It was a time of both power and vulnerability, a time when dreams could offer wisdom or warnings, and a time when the dead could return to haunt the living. For the Vikings, sleep was not a peaceful or restful experience. It was a time of profound uncertainty, where the forces of the universe could shape one's fate, often without warning or mercy. This deep connection between sleep and Norse mythology created a powerful fear of sleep, a fear that persisted throughout Viking culture and shaped their attitudes toward the mysterious, dangerous realm of dreams. Nightmares were not merely unsettling dreams for the Vikings. They were perceived as ominous forces, often seen as direct manifestations of external threats or divine omens. In a society where fate and the influence of gods were ever-present concerns, dreams, especially nightmares, were considered a powerful and significant part of life. The Vikings did not distinguish between the dream world and the waking world in the same way we do today. To them, dreams were often seen as a realm where the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest, a space where the gods could communicate, the spirits of the ancestors could visit, and dark forces could cross into the mortal realm. Therefore, the Vikings' relationship with nightmares was fraught with fear, reverence, and anxiety. Nightmares, or maror, as they were called in Old Norse, were deeply feared by Viking warriors. The term maror is the root of the modern word nightmare, and its meaning paints a vivid picture of the terror associated with such dreams. The maror was believed to be a malevolent entity that could sit upon a sleeper's chest, pressing down on them and causing a crushing weight on their chest, inducing a sense of paralysis, shortness of breath, and a feeling of helplessness. This terrifying experience was not only physical but also psychological. It represented a complete loss of control, a state in which the sleeper was utterly vulnerable. For Viking warriors, sleep was already a realm of vulnerability, and nightmares heightened that fear. A warrior who prided himself on his physical strength and mental fortitude was helpless in the face of a nightmare. The terrifying weight of the maror was symbolic of the psychological and spiritual weight a Viking carried with him daily, the ever-present anxiety of death, fate, and vulnerability. The idea that such a powerful and oppressive force could infiltrate the one space in which the warrior could rest only compounded the terror of sleep. It was a reminder that no matter how strong a warrior was in the waking world, they were still susceptible to forces beyond their control. Beyond the physical manifestations of nightmares, the Vikings were also concerned with the spiritual implications of disturbing dreams. The Vikings believed that the gods and spirits had the ability to influence dreams, and in many cases, nightmares were seen as warnings, portents of danger, or omens of death. A nightmare could be interpreted as a sign that a warrior was not living in accordance with the will of the gods, that he was straying from his fate, or that death was imminent. In a world where one's honor and destiny were paramount, a nightmare that foretold an impending death was deeply unsettling. The fear was not just of the death itself, but of the dishonor that might accompany it. There were various ways the Vikings tried to interpret and cope with the meaning of nightmares. In some cases, nightmares were seen as a form of divine intervention, a message from the gods or the spirits of the ancestors. If a warrior experienced a particularly vivid or disturbing nightmare, it could be seen as a sign that they were being called to action or that they were at a crossroads in their fate. In some cases, the dream might even offer insight into how to avoid danger or how to face an upcoming battle. For the Vikings, dreams were not just idle distractions, they were a way to communicate with the unseen world, and thus nightmares held particular weight. However, the terrifying aspect of nightmares was not limited to their supernatural or spiritual significance. The psychological toll that such dreams took on the Viking warriors was profound. Nightmares that occurred after particularly intense battles or long periods of stress could result in persistent feelings of fear and dread. A warrior who had suffered from a nightmare might awake in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, feeling as if the danger he had faced in his dream was real. These nightmares could disrupt sleep for days, even weeks, leaving the warrior emotionally and mentally drained. The fear of a nightmare could linger long after the dream had ended, and in a world where mental sharpness was as crucial as physical strength, the prolonged effects of these fearful dreams could compromise a warrior's ability to perform at his best. There was also the constant threat of nightmares related to death, an eventuality that was always looming in the minds of Viking warriors. The fear of a death that was not glorious, not honorable, was a constant anxiety. To die in one's sleep, without a chance to fight, without the opportunity to face one's fate in battle, was considered the ultimate dishonor. This fear of an undignified death could manifest in nightmares that were rooted in the terror of being unprepared, of not having lived up to one's ideals. A warrior who experienced such nightmares might wake up feeling that he had not done enough in his waking life to secure his place in the afterlife, which could create feelings of deep despair. The Vikings also had to contend with the idea of skaldic nightmares. Skalds, the poets and bards of Viking society, were revered for their ability to shape stories, to immortalize the deeds of warriors and kings in epic poems and songs. Yet even the skalds were not immune to the psychological toll of nightmares. It was said that some skalds experienced vivid dreams in which they were haunted by the spirits of the fallen, the ghosts of warriors who had not yet found peace. These skaldic nightmares could blur the lines between reality and myth, leaving the dreamer disoriented and fearful of the influence of these restless spirits. Interestingly, not all nightmares were seen as negative in Viking society. Some nightmares were believed to be transformative experiences, moments in which the dreamer was forced to confront deep, hidden fears. In this sense, the nightmare was seen as a form of spiritual testing or trial. If a warrior could face his nightmare without succumbing to fear, if he could emerge from it unscathed and resolute, then it was believed that he would be stronger in the waking world. This belief in the transformative potential of nightmares provided a way for the Vikings to cope with the terror they felt. It offered the possibility that the nightmare, while frightening in the moment, could ultimately be a source of personal growth, offering insights that would make the warrior more formidable in life and in battle. The Vikings' deeply ingrained fear of nightmares was also rooted in their understanding of the physical world. They knew that the body and mind were intimately connected, and the fear they experienced in their dreams had a direct impact on their waking lives. A nightmare that left a warrior unsettled could affect his ability to sleep properly, which in turn would affect his physical and mental readiness. A restless night, filled with fear and anxiety, could leave a warrior physically exhausted, mentally distracted, and vulnerable to attacks from both external enemies and internal doubts. Sleep deprivation, which was common in the demanding and dangerous life of a Viking warrior, could amplify the effects of nightmares, creating a vicious cycle of fear and exhaustion. The Vikings' fear of nightmares also extended to the possibility of encountering spirits during sleep, particularly those of the dead. In Viking belief, the dead were not simply gone. They could return in many forms, either to visit the living or to demand vengeance for unresolved matters. The fear of these restless spirits invading one's dreams was an ever-present concern. Some believed that the souls of the dead could enter the dreams of the living, offering warnings or insights about unresolved affairs. For a warrior, such encounters could be disorienting or frightening, as they could challenge the warrior's understanding of life and death. Were the spirits in their dreams benevolent, seeking to help? Or were they vengeful, seeking retribution for some past wrong? Ultimately, nightmares were an integral part of the Viking warriors' mental and emotional landscape. They were feared for the terror they caused, for the uncertainty they brought, and for the way they forced the warrior to confront his deepest anxieties about death, honor, and fate. Yet, as much as they were feared, nightmares were also seen as a powerful means of engaging with the supernatural, with the gods and the forces beyond human comprehension. They were not simply disruptive. They were a reminder that the line between the living and the dead was thin, and that the world of dreams was a realm where warriors, gods, and spirits met in a dance of fate and destiny. The Vikings' complex relationship with nightmares, filled with both terror and reverence, was a testament to their enduring struggle with the forces that shaped their world, forces that could be both benevolent and malevolent, both illuminating and terrifying. The Vikings lived in a world that was both brutal and beautiful, shaped by their ceaseless struggles against nature, enemies, and the inexorable march of fate. Fear was an ever-present companion in their lives, a constant undercurrent that shaped their actions, decisions, and ultimately, their destiny. It was not merely the fear of death in battle or the terror of the unknown in sleep that haunted them, but a deep, pervasive fear of failure, of dishonor, of not living up to their ideals. Fear was woven into the very fabric of Viking society, influencing everything from their warrior culture to their spiritual beliefs. The psychological and physical effects of fear on Viking warriors were profound, leaving a lasting imprint on their minds and bodies. For the Viking warrior, fear was not something to be avoided or ignored. It was something to be managed, acknowledged, and ultimately embraced as a source of power. Fear, in their worldview, was not a sign of weakness. It was a force to be harnessed. The idea that fear could be transformed into strength was central to the Viking mentality. This was particularly true in battle, where the stakes were high and the threat of death loomed large. The Vikings understood that fear could paralyze a man, rendering him useless in the face of danger, or it could be channeled into action, fueling a warrior's strength and resolve. The psychological toll of constant fear was substantial. A Viking warrior could never afford to let his guard down, to relax or allow himself the luxury of peace. His life was one of constant vigilance, of watching for enemies on the horizon, of preparing for raids, of understanding that death could come at any moment. This perpetual state of heightened awareness was exhausting. The mind was always alert, always calculating, always weighing the risks. The stress of such a lifestyle took a toll on the warrior's mental health, leading to a state of constant anxiety, restlessness, and dread. There was no moment in which the warrior could simply exist without the shadow of fear hanging over him. This anxiety would have manifested in many ways. The Vikings, much like modern soldiers in combat, would have experienced heightened arousal, an overwhelming sense of hypervigilance. They would have had trouble relaxing or sleeping, knowing that any moment could be their last. Such a lifestyle also left the warrior prone to bouts of depression and mental exhaustion, as the unrelenting stress would eventually wear down the strongest of men. This mental strain could lead to what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, flashbacks, nightmares, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Sleep, which was already fraught with vulnerability, was doubly difficult for the Viking warrior. Not only was sleep a time when he was physically exposed to the dangers of the world, but it was also a time when his mind could not escape the ceaseless waves of anxiety that came from living in a world defined by conflict and violence. A Viking warrior, after a long day of raiding or preparing for battle, would have struggled to quiet his mind. The fear of what might come in the night, the fear of what might happen in his dreams, would weigh heavily on him, making restful sleep elusive. The cumulative toll of sleepless nights would leave him mentally fatigued, unable to fully focus or function at his peak. Physically, the effects of fear were just as severe. The Vikings, who prided themselves on their strength and endurance, often had to deal with the toll that constant fear took on their bodies. Fear triggers a physiological response that prepares the body for a fight-or-flight situation. This means that the body is flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, hormones that increase heart rate, blood pressure, and alertness. In the short term, this response was invaluable in battle, where speed, strength, and focus were critical to survival. But over time, the repeated activation of this stress response would take a toll on the warrior's body. Chronic stress and anxiety led to physical wear and tear, muscle tension, headaches, digestive issues, and sleep disturbances.